pleased to introduce today Jim Grace of USGS, the National Wetland Research Center in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I only met Jim in passing at ESA a couple of years ago, but then we've had a chance to chat the last few days. But my introduction to Jim initially was through some of his more prolific work, which is his most heavily cited publication, which is his book with Bruce McCune. So what I've pulled up here is actually an analysis of ecological communities, which was put out by a MGM software in Glenarden Beach, Oregon, of all academic publishers. But what is it, cited 2,000, 3,000 times now?
4,000 something.
4,000 something?
Yeah.
But who's counting, right? So it was interesting because we were talking about the book, and it's very much a multivariate statistics book and an intro in PC-ORD, but at the very bottom, in chapter 6, you see this funny intro to these structural models. And before I knew much about Jim's work in plant ecology and his work in wetlands, I kind of, like, well, this is a weird chapter, but, you know, it seems intuitive, it makes sense. And a few years down the road, I actually had a use for structural models, and I moved over into the kind of more grown-up version, which is the Structural Equation Modeling in Natural Systems book that he put out in 2006 now. Mm-hmm. So I highly recommend both books. They're a great intro to both the data that Jim works with as well as the framework from which he approaches science. And that's really what's impressive. Is one of the first things we got to small talking about was college football. Rather than tell me he's like a diehard LSU fan, he started talking about analytical things. So I mean, he's not a homer. He's always thinking about the data. And I'm very pleased that today he's going to give a little less. Well, I'm not pleased about this, but I'm pleased he's going to give a talk that's using the same frameworks and using similar data, but it's not going to be as numerically, you know, intimidating as the idea of structural equations that was introduced yesterday, perhaps. So, that said, rather than scare you, I'll let Jim speak for himself. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Jim Grace.
Thanks. Well, first, thanks to the ecology students for inviting me here. Thanks, Nate has been shepherding me around. I was a little disconnected with the people meeting for lunch today, and the next thing I know, there were people flooding in from all parts of campuses with phone calls and everything. Have you connected with? So there was a lot of attention being paid. I really appreciate the hospitality. So what I want to talk about today is a bit of a different example, much more on-the-ground practical example, continuing with the theme of trying to develop hypotheses about how the components of systems are working and then test those hypotheses. And I probably should have spent more time pruning the title before I sent it, but the main title is Discovering Elements of Ecological Memory, and I'll talk about what that is and how we conceptualize that. These elements of ecological memory that contribute to the resilience of ecosystems. So the focus in this talk today is going to be about resilience. It's going to be about fire, invasive species coming into grasslands, and so forth. But then with my usual methodological approach to trying to see if we can take a systems view of this with a bit of prediction on the end. So ecological resilience, according to classical stability theory, is the behavior within a single domain of attraction. So here I'm just filling in the real basics of talking about resilience. We have classical engineering type resilience first being mentioned, where you have some slosh within a single domain of attraction. So you might have some stable equilibrium. Imagine a bridge that is being buffeted by the wind, and then it starts going up and down, and it remains oscillating around some kind of stable structure, unless perhaps it gets to the point of failure. And in this case, we're using instead two species interacting, but it's really an engineering kind of a concept that says things are either stable or they are unstable. And one of the ways we represent this visually is a cup and ball model that as long as the ball stays inside of the cup, then there's some degree of resilience, and resilience in this context used to be, or I suppose maybe it still is, measured as the rate at which you come back to where you started. But a different idea was proposed for ecological systems by Buzz Holling, who pointed to there being perhaps more than one stable domain, and the movement of a system between domains, and in particular, as we'll see, across thresholds from one domain to another. And the resilience in this context being redefined, ecological resilience, as being the ability of a system to withstand being altered and still retain its essential characteristics. And this seems quite abstract, but we have many very concrete examples. And I know many of you are working with a lot of these same kinds of grassland, shrubland systems where you get this state change and you can't seem to get back to the other state change and wonder what the thresholds are that have driven it. Those are all practical manifestations of these general ideas. So what we think for these ecological systems that can have multiple domains is that we might have different domains of attraction and some kind of a boundary that once you cross that boundary, you're now into this domain. And so in this domain, you might have things, forcings and other variations, but if it gets pushed into the next, beyond this line, beyond this point, now it's caught in another domain of attraction. And the cup and ball model that goes with this is sort of a two-basin cup and ball model where enough force can cause the activation energy to exceed what's required to wind up in a new state where it then wants to stay in the new state. That's the real distinct feature here. One of the classic examples, and there are many, many now, is just water hyacinth coming back into Lake Victoria and being tied to a critical threshold of nutrient loading, that below certain nutrient concentration levels, the plants living on the surface of the water just simply can't get enough nutrients out of the water, and then above that they can, and they take over the lake and dominate its physiology. Terrestrial examples are very common, involving either native or otherwise grassland communities and shrubs coming in. And we have many, many cases where we know that there's been an alteration to the system, so it's now shrub dominated, and we tried to find ways to maybe tip it back through burning and other kinds of management to the what the historical record tells us was the native state, and we often have quite a difficulty to be able to do that. So this idea of memory theory is something that I think there's plenty of precedence of it in the literature, but based on some work that we've been doing with the SAGE STEP study, based on my own work that I'm going to be talking about here, really thinking that systems that retain elements of historic adaptation constitute a source of memory, so that when the system is hit with some kind of disturbance or some kind of alteration, it can reassemble in a highly adapted way. And that memory, when you start pulling that memory out, when you start removing the elements of memory, that perhaps the resilience of the system is being degraded. So memory theory refers to this idea that the stability of historical states depends on the system memory and essentially, if you will, the assembly and the evolution under those historic conditions. So the memory can be defined as legacies of information or material, and by information we might mean genotypes, ecotypes, processes, relationships that contribute to either the continued function of the historic system or a reassembly after the fact. So if you come through and have a big alteration to a prairie, but it has a good seed bank with the historic elements, it can reassemble itself, for example. So there are 5 propositions that I have assembled to constitute a backbone for memory theory. The first proposition is that the resistance and resilience depends on the source of memory available to that system, whether through dispersal, out of the seed bank, brought in, or otherwise. The second is that the memory is contained within the historical information. So the memory is really, just like we think about evolution and diversity representing a source of accumulated successful knowledge through the genetic information, that memory can be contained within these things, but it's latent. We typically won't be directly measuring the latent memory, but it's contained within things. So it's a latent factor. The sources of memory act collectively and nonlinearly, and that degrading forces like invasive species or human alterations of conditions can degrade those sources of memory. So hypothetically, a loss of adapted native species from the species pool is a degradation of that memory. And that then there's still a bottom line here that it's always conditional, that we have to be clear that resilience is not a global attribute. It's resilience in a certain set of properties to a certain set of circumstances. And so we have to always keep in mind that there might be different types of memory that serve to buffer against particular types of alterations. And so if we come in and do something that's brand new, that the system has never seen before, even if it still has a lot of its historic elements, it may not be adapted to those new conditions. So there is this conditional or situational context. So we talk about sources of ecological memory. What are some of these? Well, biodiversity. So very often we look at diversity, genetic diversity, and equate that with some degree of memory in the system. That's obviously overly simplistic. And again, context specific. Depends on whether you now have a system that's been badly degraded, in which you've lost a lot of native types. But there's quite a bit of evidence to support that, at least in general, both functional and species diversity ought to serve as one source of memory. The actual stocks of native plants and animals can serve as a source of memory. So in corals, when you have corals that survive a hurricane or other kind of damage or an oil spill or something, they provide as a source of propagules for recolonization. Or the stocks of perennial plants. So you got your perennial bunch grasses can play a really special role because those remaining pieces serve as a reservoir of repopulation. Same, of course, with animals as well. Species with adaptations to historic conditions. And this is very important because if we look back in the historic record at, say, climate, what we know is that climate has been highly variable at different points in time. We had a little ice age in the late 1800s. And then we went through a period of very benign, stable conditions for about 100 years. And then now the variation has kicked back in. So the time frame, it's really based on the notion that adversity creates adaptations that can be useful if they're still there. And naturally, they may be lost as well. If you go through a period of time that's abnormally stable, you might lose a lot of the memory that would help you when it becomes highly fluctuating again. Obviously, seed and propagule banks are part of that, but then we have to keep in mind things like transport agents, and if you're dealing with grasslands or plants in general, we know that we've lost a huge fraction of our pollinators, and that's a source of memory that could really come back and bite us. Below ground reserve, soil organic. These are really culled from the literature on resilience and the kinds of things that could serve as sources of memory. So it's one thing to have a general idea like this, and it's quite another to be able to move forward and make it operational and testable. So one of the challenges that I like to tackle is how do we make such an idea operational? And the framework that I use, and I talked about this yesterday in a rather different context, but the framework that I use is a methodology known as structural equation modeling that has been around for almost 100 years in one form or another. And it's a methodology of probabilistic network analysis that's aimed at evaluating hypotheses about systems in terms of networks. And so the underlying premise is that if we look at a system, there are many ways we might abstract that system. But one way is to look at it as a connected network of cause-effect relationships with a probabilistic kind of response to it. And structural equation modeling is a methodology, a system for representing your own hypotheses about that, and then also being able to test those. So in this case, we see the mind of, I think it's Archimedes actually here, who's got drawn on it this causal probabilistic network. This is a book that actually launched the idea of Bayesian networks, but it's also has gone back and drawn upon structural equation modeling for these basic ideas. So how can we take that notion and make some progress towards these propositions in the idea of memory theory? So memory theory says that regime change, shift from one state to another, is a function of how hard the system is pushed, the degree of perturbation, and the amount of resilience. So resilience is this underlying capacity. It's inherently going to be hard to study, right? Hard to quantitatively evaluate. You won't even know if there's any there until the system gets kicked. But then if it gets kicked and it doesn't switch, or even if it does switch, you still don't know exactly how much resilience there was, right? So quantifying the resilience and understanding the factors that describe its variation sort of starts at this part of the model. And what we're saying is that resilience is a function in part of system reactions, that if you have a fire that comes into a system, then the response of the plant community and the soil and so forth to that is part of what's going to determine the resilience. At the same time, we have another category that we've brought in to try to generalize called sources of innovation. What we're thinking about here now is socio-ecological systems. So resilience is one of these ideas that ecologists think about a lot and social scientists think about even more. So the resilience of socio-ecological systems often talks about sources of innovation. And we can have ecological sources of innovation, but very often these are what's being brought in here is the ability of a community of people to suddenly adapt, say, their water use to accommodate the approaching loss of resilience for droughts, as an example. So one of the reasons I keep this in here, even though it won't play a real big role in what we're doing, it does when it comes into practice. So sources of innovation become our placeholder for whether someone wants to use a strategic fire or to choose the circumstances under which they're burning very carefully. And that's an innovation that is imposed on the system to try, usually to try and promote the resilience. And ecological memory then is viewed as this, again, latent set of properties that determine the system reactions and also the sort of unobserved or unanticipated response of the system. Degrading agents and events are things like invasive species or loss of native diversity or loss of certain key components. And those too are very much influenced by historical conditions. So this is meant to be a pretty broad translation of essentially what is largely a verbal argument. So most ecological theory, probably theory in social sciences as well, is really defined at the linguistic level. We talk about memory theory. We use that phrase. We try to define it, and every one of you thinks of a different set of examples, and then we get in a big discussion where we're thinking about different examples and so forth. And part of the idea here is to be able to be rigorous and turn this into something that can be tested and falsified in a way that you and I know where we're on a different page. So here is a representation. At this point, the ideas are all linguistic and conceptual, so these are considered to be theoretical constructs at this point. And the application that I want to use for the theory today is to understand the resilience of the coastal tallgrass prairie, which is in Louisiana and Texas, using this framework. The question of resilience of what to what is answered with the resilience of the native community in the face of exotic invasion. So let's first take a look at the coastal tallgrass prairie. Even a lot of prairie ecologists don't know about it because it was exterminated so quickly after railroads came through. And it was as soon as the railroad came through, basically people moved into the area in greater numbers, and there was a delineation by the Soil Conservation Service as cropland. So on all the maps, it's cropland. The German prairie farmers came down with their sod busting plows, and it just started being converted either to agriculture or to ranching lands. And at that time, right after the railroad, there was something like 10 million cattle brought into Texas in a 5-year period, some crazy number. It's completely unsustainable, but there was this huge event that happened, and as a result, a lot of people don't know about this. But in yellow, we had tallgrass prairie all the way from Lafayette, Louisiana, where I'm located. It was a great big lobe that pinched down at the bordered by forest on the north at the boundary, and then came all the way down here, and there's a little bit of a disjunct all the way down to Mexico. And a very large area, there's less than 1% remains. What has turned out to be a bit of a relief from the total degree is that a lot of the remaining pieces are on federally protected lands. So we're very fortunate in that regard. They are of various qualities, but there's some pretty good ones. And you see here all these different wildlife refuges, and then the different national seashores, so forth, where there are still remnants there. So we've been able to work with those groups. What's at stake? Well, the most high-profile endangered species is the whooping crane, but right along with it is the Atwater's prairie chicken. And the Atwater's prairie chicken, unfortunately, is caught in one of these extinction vortexes where we're continually breeding chicks and putting them out there, and they're getting eaten and killed. And we're continuing trying to get this population up to a level where it can sustain itself. Whooping cranes, on the other hand, have been doing generally pretty well, but their exclusive wintering grounds for the migratory population is in the coastal prairie. And many rare plants, the total diversity of plants in the system is very high. So a lot of grassland birds, a lot of invertebrates, and so forth as well. So there's a lot at stake. The enemy in this case, the invader, the degrader of resilience in the system potentially, is Chinese tallow tree. And Chinese tallow tree produces a very large seed. I'll go through its characteristics on the next slide. But it has a distribution that covers this area that the prairie is in, and actually has been extending since the time of this map. It has been extending down there. We discovered it coming into the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge when we visited a number of years ago. We sat down and met with them and talked about our prairie program, and I said, well, what are you doing about Chinese tallow? And they said, what Chinese tallow? So the Chinese tallow is growing right outside your gate. So the good news is that we caught it really early, but they're out there essentially one tree at a time, killing it one way or another every year. So it's a real threat to them, and not an easy thing to deal with. So some of the characteristics of the Chinese tallow tree: it's imported from China. It has been cultivated in China as a crop species for oil production for 14 centuries. So it's a very fast growth rate. It seems to have escaped from enemies here. It has none of the invertebrate herbivores and so forth that it has in its native range. It's taking over a lot of native systems, and if you get down into the Houston area and some of those areas, both forest and prairie, and I'll show some pictures of what it's capable of doing, it really is an ecosystem killer in a lot of ways. It's unpalatable to cattle. Seed-eating birds like it and will disperse it. And one of its attributes that's real distinctive is sort of the polar opposite of cheatgrass, in that it makes the system non-flammable. It won't carry a fire, and it suppresses herbaceous fuel. So once it gets to a certain abundance in that system, you can't burn it anymore. And that becomes the end game of the phase shift for that system, unless you can do a lot of things to change that. And there are other things that we know that it does because of its impacts on the herbaceous layer, of altering erosion patterns and changing soil characteristics even. So how bad can it get? This is just a picture showing you a managed prairie in one area where they stopped active management about 20 years ago, and now you've got this forest with virtually nothing growing under there, incredibly low diversity. And then here is the grassland being taken over and invaded by the smaller Chinese tallow. And as we'll see, part of the question is knowing, when have you already lost this system? I mean, is it gone to, say, fire by control already and we don't know it yet? Or is this manageable if we have the right intensity of fire and the right sequence of events? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to get at. So we start off with coastal prairie, which often has a potential or partial resistance to invasion, and can be quite competitive against Chinese tallow tree until there's a sufficient gap or opening or something for those trees to get started and successfully establish. And then once they successfully establish and get above the grasses, then they begin to gather sort of an increasing advantage. They are susceptible to fire at this early stage, but they resprout unless they're burned at a very small size. Then once you start developing the stand, then you can run the fire right up to it and the fire goes out. Here's one of our sites showing the monotypic forest more closely. And so the question is, at what point in this invasion will fire still control tallow? So we can look at this in a resilience threshold kind of a mechanism as a fire severity tree size kind of threshold. And so the notion is that there's a critical threshold that's a function of the size of the trees and the severity of the fire that you can put in there. And a lot of things affect severity of fire: weather conditions, fuel conditions, fueling techniques, a whole host of things. Ultimately, the trees themselves reduce the potential for severe fire. But there's a threshold where once the trees are above a certain size and the fire severity only can reach a certain level, then now you're caught in a self-reinforcing system where the system won't burn. Chinese tallow will continue to reproduce itself. But if you can burn it before it gets to a certain size and can control it, you can maintain it in this fire-controlled ecosystem. And so this is our graphical representation of this threshold hypothesis. The data that are used in this presentation, we developed 400 plots randomly located that were tree-centered plots. And so we really wanted to see how trees responded as a function of size class and the conditions around the tree. And then there were two burns. There was a growing season and a non-growing season burn as well. And they used a wide range of the natural variation in plant types and soil types and so forth to give us some generalizability. Here, this color infrared, you can see that the tallow really likes to establish in the wettest areas and then tends to migrate into the terrestrial habitat. And that's really an unfortunate feature because those riparian edges often tend to be quite non-competitive, and the tree grows very fast there. It can withstand very extreme drought conditions as well, but it grows fastest and those seeds float, so they tend to establish there. It's really hard to control that side of things. So how do we evaluate this model? Well, a little bit about the structural equation modeling process. We like to start with our theoretical ideas and step those down to specify a testable model. And historically, this has been here's my model, and here's what I concluded kind of a process. And that's not really adequate. We really need more steps in the translation of theory process if we're to have any kind of generalizability, and I have some notion of why you chose the metrics that you did and put them in the model in the particular places. So we've added steps to all of these individual pieces: model specification, measures and samples. And then down here we get into a part that I'm going to illustrate a little bit more what it's about. It's the business of estimating and testing the model to see if it's consistent with the data, or whether the data suggests that other processes are operating that weren't anticipated by your model. And that's one of the things network models, as we'll see, allow you to do, is to declare that my model's wrong because there's something else entirely happening that I didn't anticipate, and it has an effect on all of the other parts of it. So here's just an illustration from a completely different example of meta-modeling. So this is some studies of wetlands up in Acadia National Park where we're looking at human activities and the two primary mechanisms that human activities usually go through to influence biological integrity, either altered nutrient loading or altered hydrology. So we've got a lot of studies of wetlands and how they're altered and what kinds of effects that can be. So these are the two big-scale notions. So this is our high-level meta-model. And then this model gets stepped down based on the observables. So we have measures of intensity of land use, for example, for different wetlands, and hydrologic alteration, and how far into the buffer zone around the wetland there's been effects, and whether the soil has been disturbed next to the wetland and so forth. And so we're taking these general ideas and we're starting to step them down so that we can be very explicit about how our ideas are translated. And this is an attempt to avoid any more than we can what's called linguistic uncertainty. So in modeling, we often talk about uncertainty due to all kinds of factors, sampling uncertainty and detection uncertainty, but there's also linguistic uncertainty, and this allows us to be explicit about it. And in this particular case, we had identified through some bioassessments some particular biotic integrity measures that were represented. So this became the level 2 or phase 2 meta-model, and then we had to work with the variables that we had available. So some things like the beaver study goes away because we don't have those variables. We have to absorb that as an anticipated effect with no mediating variable. And going through the process of evaluating this versus the data leads us to go through a process that looks like this. So when we have a hypothesis, the key characteristic of our structural equation modeling approach is to say, okay, given the hypothesis and given the relationships in our data, summarized as the covariances, or if you will, correlations among variables, we can bring those two pieces of information, estimate the parameters, see how they match up, how the model implied predictions match with the data, and arrive at a process of fitting and testing that. And when you do that, for the example that I'm talking about, you find all these additional processes. The red arrows represent unanticipated effects or mechanisms operating in this system. And so there's a discovery component to it. There's also a component represented by the X's where we didn't find support for certain things that we had hypothesized. And so it's a bit of a unique property, if you will, or at least a fairly unusual property for the methodology, that it looks to see if things add up, and when they don't, it tells you your model failed because there's something else going on. And we've discovered a number of really, I think, now we see them as important things that are operating in different systems from this process. So let's go through here and talk about what indicator variables we have for this memory model. Well, with applying a fire to this system, we don't really have a degree of perturbation. So we conducted the fire in order to be able to achieve, at least to some degree, a complete burn. And so we won't have a degree of perturbation. Everything had fire go across it. Our determination of regime change is based on whether the tree was bigger when you came back for the next burn or smaller, because the idea is that you can only burn about every 2 years in this system. And if it's this tall when you burn it, and it dies back down and resprouts, and then you come back 2 years later and it's this tall, it's already gotten away from you. You know, we're simplifying a lot. But basically, it was already big enough that the resprouts were going to mean that you get pushed back, but then even further, next time even further. On the other hand, if you come back and it has resprouted only up to here, but it was this tall, then presumably you're on the other side of that line. So we declared a burn as successful or unsuccessful in a practical way, depending upon whether the post-burn measurement height was equal to or less than or greater than the pre-burn height. Resilience in this context is latent. It's an underlying property. There's no real way to measure it. And in structural equation modeling, we can propose that there's an underlying latent process, and we're going to infer something about it based on how the rest of the system behaves. This latent variable concept goes back to early studies on human intelligence, where we believe that people have attributes, and we can't measure those attributes directly. There's some kind of internal machinery, but we can get some measures of them indirectly. And that, Mark, what are some of the common latent human properties you think that would resonate with the crowd here? Willingness to cooperate, is that a serious one?
There's a bunch of things like intention, willingness, attitudes toward some, you can ask people what their attitudes are.
Right.
They can't measure their willingness to do something. Their social, how much peer pressure affects them, things like that.
Right, right. Well, those are the imperfections of it. But we do have these latent human properties that social scientists have identified as potentially being real things. I mean, that's kind of the deal with the latent variable is it's one thing to have a concept. It's another to identify something like self-esteem that perhaps shows up as really explaining data patterns. We know from human intelligence that certainly we do have some kinds of finite number of latent properties. It's not an infinite. We're not just an infinite combination of things. But that's the tradition from which the latent variable inclusion comes from. The system reactions in this case depend on how severe was the fire. I got Rowdy's next door. I'm going to have to get a little bit louder. Fire severity in this case is a system reaction because the fire severity depends upon the nature of the species that are there, how flammable they are, how abundant they are and so forth. The recovery from fire is also another system reaction that could potentially have a lot to do with resilience. And then tallow regrowth is another system reaction that in this case will have a lot to do with whether our measure of regime change falls on one side or the other. Sources of innovation in this case are the firing techniques, and so we really have a limited set. For the most part, people tend to try to burn either in the dormant season for a variety of reasons or in the growing season, mostly because it hypothetically should be more effective in the growing season. Most things work against you with growing season burns, but those are really our choices or the measures we have available for that. So ecological memory, what do we have? We actually looked at a lot of properties. We measured a lot of variables here, and some of the key ones were the gamma diversity or the pool of species available for recolonization based on our censuses. The other was the small-scale diversity in the plot. So we're really interested whether we could see an effect from the small-scale diversity in the plot or from the larger-scale diversity around, exclusively looking at native species. The biomass of the community, whether it had been degraded a lot by the tree, because the bigger trees degrade the grass. We can actually separate the effect of tree size from grass under the tree contribution using these methods. And then are there certain particular species that seem to contribute to resilience in the system? In this case, the degrading agent in this experiment is the tallow tree size. So we expect it to have a great deal of effect, and we're quite interested in the things that offset that effect. The historical conditions include the fact that we had two areas that had never been plowed, they had been grazed, and then we also had two areas that had been plowed and the soil had been disturbed. And we know that historically those have a tremendous degradation of their attributes. Even if you have the native species there, you don't get as much cover, you don't have the same attributes, and the species diversity is potentially quite depleted. So here we've brought in the measurement variables, and we go through a process of seeing which, if any of these, contribute to this model by running a series of models, cycling these variables in. So one of the things that we have to think about then is how do we conceptualize resilience? So the different ways we could think about thresholds. Thresholds can be change points where you have some change in slope. So we might have change point regression that would pick up a change point. Another would be some kind of a balance between increase and decrease. In this case, the way that we have chosen to conceptualize resilience and to specify resilience as a sort of a logistic type function, if you will, where there's some underlying threshold, but there's a continuous probability that has a sigmoid shape, and then what you're observing are either the ones or the zeros. And so as the probability is low, typically you're going to observe zeros. Not always. You can have some ones. But then as you get to higher and higher probability, then you start picking up more and more ones. And so by looking at zeros and ones, we can actually estimate the underlying probability of a 0 and 1 and model that. And so that's how we chose to conceptualize resilience, was an underlying probability of staying within your domain of attraction, recognizing that these are somewhat stochastic systems and that there will be some stochastic behavior. And the way that then winds up being manifested is that we have the grass-controlled state and the tallow-controlled state, and those represent our zeros, the tallow-controlled state, and our ones, the grass-controlled state, depending upon the amount of regrowth. So what were the results that we got? And we'll first recognize that we've organized the information this way, that we've got resilience down here, and that above it we're looking at the response, right? And we've got a couple kinds of responses that wind up in our model: fire severity and vegetation recovery, which itself was a complex and partially latent process. Ecological memory types that stayed in the model were not the local small-scale alpha diversity, but the species pool was from a larger area around the plot was a successful predictor, as well as the community biomass and the presence of certain species that seemed to really promote high-intensity fires. Tallow tree size, of course, the study was set up to have that, and tillage history in there as well. So the things directly connecting to resilience included Of course, the tree size having a substantial effect. The taller the tree, the less resilient the system would be. That the more severe fire, the better the resilience would be. And that the rate of vegetation recovery, also very important for resilience. But the season of burn, also very important for resilience. So even though we're collecting zeros and ones as responses across these 400 plots, we were able to see that we have substantially better probability of success from a growing season burn compared to a dormant season burn. And we recover in ecological world, quite a nice R-square for this system when we were predicting the underlying probabilities. Season of burn has an additional effect, and the season of burn not only has an effect on the ability of the plants to respond, because during the dormant season the trees are less affected, if you will. They can resprout more easily. But also the fires tend to be more severe, and so there's two effects that contribute to the season of burn. One is the fires are more severe in the growing season. The species pool, interestingly, had an effect on fire severity, and that was quite a surprise. That's one of the pieces that's still a big mystery. I think we need further studies to be able to get a sense of why it turned out that there was this connection of species pool. But one possibility is that fire behavior is not driven by something at the meter square size. It's driven by a larger area, which is the area over which we were measuring the species pool. So we were measuring the species pool on a 10-meter diameter around, and I think that's more of the scale at which the fire behavior operates. And fire behavior in these systems is very dependent upon how patchy the vegetation is. If you've got stuff growing everywhere, as perhaps we don't really have a way of measuring this, recovering this, but if the more areas with higher variety of species had more continuous cover, that could explain the higher severity fire. The effect was quite pronounced. 0.67 is one of the stronger pathways that we detected. Community biomass, of course, also contributed to fire severity, a little bit less than we might have thought, but species identity, certain species turned out to be, if you will, inhibitory to fire behavior. They tended to sizzle and fizzle and not allow the fire to spread, and so those showed up as important as well. Vegetation recovery was the other thing that responded very strongly or depended very strongly on species pool. So while I was not really expecting all of those diversity enhancement effects, I know plenty of people out there will say, I knew it was going to be there. Biodiversity, ecosystem function, right? And also then areas that had more community biomass showed more vegetation recovery as well. The tillage history had a very strong negative effect on species pool, and so we could trace its influence down through these various pathways to see what the net consequences or even partial consequences would be. And then we did pick up this negative effect of larger trees producing less herbaceous community, which is one of their effects, and that indirectly percolates through. But that, I think, again, we don't have a good variance explanation there because this is a system where we really perhaps should have been measuring plots at a little bit different scale, but because we're dealing with seedlings, we actually planted in very small ones. Seedlings from this size to, huge, then coming up with an appropriate standard plot size was actually quite difficult to do. So a few selected results if we want to visualize this. So we can actually come in now and extract estimates of resilience. So again, we observed zeros and ones, but we estimated probabilities. And so here's a graph where we have, if you will, a semi-continuous set of resilience values from 1 to 0. And we can we can visualize those against fire severity. And what we see is that fires tended to be either really complete or not so complete, and the so-so burning of any individual plot. So that's part of what's going on. As the trees they're still small, they get burned because they haven't done much to really ameliorate the fire conditions. But once they get above a certain size and the fuel drops, then they won't burn. And so it ends up being kind of a U-shaped distribution, frequency distribution. The other thing we can see is how resilience drops with tree height. Surprisingly, tree height shows a linear-ish kind of relationship. Wouldn't necessarily have predicted that. Here's the growing season burn between dormant season and growing season. We get to see sort of, if you will, the mean difference between those two. And then finally the vegetation recovery, which itself is a latent variable. So here we're plotting latent score estimates for two different variables against each other to let us visualize what these partial effects are. So these are meant to be the effect of a variable if you varied it by itself, leaving the other variables alone. So that's what we're visualizing the estimates here. So in summary, resilience was enhanced by the gamma diversity or the species pool. Certain species tended to contribute to fire behavior and resilience more than others. High community biomass in the herbaceous layer was important, as well as severe fires and even drier conditions, which were during the growing season. Large trees reduce resilience, including two mechanisms. One is an inherent capacity to resprout. The other was a suppression of fuel. And one of the things I didn't show in here, because this was just about as complicated a model as I ever want to present, but there are some elevational gradient effects that are being adjusted for that we have measurements of, so we can say what these estimates are at any particular elevation or point along the elevation gradient from a riverside to higher and drier. So one of the things we can do then is we can say, well, given our equations and our results, what are some of the scenarios? So what's the best case of we can get for a burn? Well, there are cases, and so this was something that surprised me. There are cases where you get a really good fire and you've got fuel around a really big tree. So these trees might be this big. The base crown would be several meters across. It might be 6 meters tall. But you get a good fire going at that. And at first, it looks like you didn't do anything, drops a few leaves. And then you come back next year, and you find out it's really been damaged by that. There's a delayed mortality. So under the best case circumstances, for a small number of the trees that are isolated from each other, it is possible to kill even the biggest tree. Worst case is there are cases where the site is so degraded and there's not enough fuel that you're just not going to be able to have any success. And then we can look at what the average summer burn versus the average winter burn is. And so here we see the height-specific success of the average summer burn pretty good. You know, we can say that we're recovering the system up till we get over 3 meters in height on average with trees. And that's a little bit better even than the best winter burn. And that the average summer burn under low diversity in fact, will be not nearly as good. So this is the prediction line for the ambient or observed diversity with a summer burn. But if we had an area with low diversity, we would expect much less performance. And so we can take the model results, create a set of prediction equations, and start doing that thing that we rarely ever do with our statistical analysis, is to take our coefficients and then start playing scenarios. What would happen if? What do these results suggest? Now, of course, what we want to do is to be able to go back with the next set of data. When we do have a follow-up set of fires, so we do have another set of data to validate, further test, and then determine if repeat burning has some additional effect in this system. But these are the kinds of results that we're getting at. I think they're very practical as well as insightful. And you know, we're hoping that we have some prairie left for the prairie chicken when we finally figure out how to, maybe we got to teach the chicks how to fight off hawks or skunks or something. I'm not sure what it's going to take, but we've got the breeding programs going. We should be able to get the Atwater prairie chicken back if we have some prairie to put it in. So that's the talk for today. Thank you. Yeah.
So you had up there, you didn't mention it, but one of the last summary things you had when you were talking about the results was that things were nonlinear and non-additive. How do you get that out of this completely linear and additive?
Well, the modeling isn't completely linear and additive. I only showed you the summary results. So there were interaction terms, there were some nonlinear effects in there. It was really interesting in the modeling to first follow the R-squares, if you will, where you throw in an interaction term and you get a nice jump in an R-square, and then you go and you do the predicted versus observed and discover, oh, I just overfit the data. You know, this is wrong. So some of those are probably not as, it's not clear exactly how much nonlinearity and non-additivity we have, but part of the point here is to tell people to look for it. You know, these are not methods where it automatically looks for these more complex functional forms. You have to know to look for them. So to some degree, letting this lesson be out there is just for the next investigator to know, okay, I need to be looking for some interactive effect between species pool and community biomass that is contributing to this, this memory effect in the system.
Speaking of that species pool, can you put up the final model? I was just curious, did you use coordination axes, or how did you represent that in, you know, what was the measured data that went into that term?
Which one?
Species pool?
No, species pool is the total number of species that occurred within a 10-meter diameter circle centered on the tree. So yeah. So it's just because that varied, particularly it varied between the old field and the unplowed sites. But there also were variations, and they vary along that gradient. See, so we got this elevation gradient from the riverside up. And a lot of things are changing along that, but one of the things we know is that diversity drops as you get closer to flooding. And so that's another kind of effect that is managed in here, but you know, this is all I'm going to show you because this is all you'll want to see at this point, right? The biggest problem with this is you learn so much from your data that then you've got to distill it down to a story for others. So you have to go through this this process of trying to extract the biggest components and maybe either hide or consolidate some of the finer details that aren't going to change the story, but could definitely cause people to overload. So yeah, some of that stuff we call them controlled for. So elevation effects are controlled for here. They're not shown explicitly, but they can have interactive effects with the other things as well. Yeah.
Says, oh, you're missing something big, and then you say, oh, maybe we're missing utility history to put it in. Does it give you, how stable are the results? Like when you add in those new elements, does it give you totally different results?
Well, so we did a stability analysis on this model because we had a long list of things to look at, and we had different scales at which we could bin a few things. It wasn't a vast exploration of model space, but it was, you know, we probably looked at 20 or 30 models before we were done. So the question is, would we always arrive at the same model? And so what we do at the end is we come in and we start saying, well, you know, we had this other variable in there that we thought might be important, alpha diversity. Let's throw it in at the end. See if now maybe the other things are controlled, does it stay in? Or let's pull something out and see if we notice a degradation that's a substantial degradation. So we did a sensitivity analysis of that sort. You're always missing stuff. So there's a second question. It's not about the methodology. I mean, all the models are incomplete, and the consequences of them being incomplete are various. And so there are certain things that you can remove that will be absorbed. And so in talking about network models, there are nodes that are absorbable. So things along a causal chain, for example, you should be able to absorb certain ones that are not at forks. And there's actually a set of rules in graph theory for which of these things you have to have and you don't have to have. So there's two parts to getting causal models. One is, can I defend the plausibility that fire severity affects resilience and not vice versa within the confines of these data? And so a lot of those things are pretty easy to defend, and we often propose statistical models where we have that level of support. But then the harder part is to say, is this really an unbiased estimate of the causal effect? And that the only way I know to get at that is with the next data set. Because there's something called the missing variable or the third variable problem. There could be something that we didn't measure that affects this and affects that. And therefore it biases this coefficient. And that's always possible. The only case it's not possible is if you randomized all the variables, and you can't do that because some variables are being affected by other variables. So randomized experiments allow you to get away from the backdoor problem of a backdoor association that contaminates, or backdoor effect that contaminates the estimate. But you can't include the causal chain because you can't randomize everything. It doesn't work that way. So that's kind of the other result, is to have this other data set, which we have, and then come along and say, well, let's predict now from these. We'll both model, but we'll also predict and see how we did, because these are a set of predictions. So, other questions?
Kind of a little bit of a follow-up to that one.
Okay.
So is a part of the modeling process, is it dropping out variables and seeing how the model runs and then putting them back in to see how it runs? Is that part of how it works, or no?
Well, you're kind of asking, how does art work? In other words, this is obviously a very complex and sophisticated system. That's how I work, right? So that's what we did in this case. But it's not like it's a canned protocol that everyone would automatically do that. So it's not automated. There certainly is a lot of interest in automating this whole process, at which point you'll have a robot up here who's giving the talk who will be far smarter than I am once we get to that point. But right now we aren't at that point where we can automate the entire process. There's a tremendous amount of expert judgment that has to come into this. Great. Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate your attention.